You don't always realize the moment something shifts, but suddenly, the silence starts feeling different, and what you thought was fading begins to feel more present than ever. Take a moment to slow everything down and let yourself settle into a quieter state. Let the mental noise fade into the background for a while, and gently turn your attention inward, toward what you've actually been feeling underneath it all. You may have noticed something recently that's hard to put into clear words. At times, there's a strange pressure in your chest that appears without warning. A sudden thought of someone specific surfaces out of nowhere. And beneath your usual day-to-day rhythm, there's this subtle, restless energy, almost like an electric current moving quietly under the surface. It doesn't feel random. In fact, it may not feel like imagination either. It can come across like a kind of signal, as if something within you is registering emotions and possibilities before your conscious mind has fully processed them. Your deeper awareness often operates beyond logic, beyond conversations, beyond anything visible on the surface. It picks up on subtle shifts long before they turn into something obvious in the external world. That's why it might feel like something is changing with this person, even without clear proof in front of you. That quiet pull in your chest, the one you may have tried to brush off as overthinking or hope, can feel more like an inner nudge, a reminder that this connection still holds something unresolved, something that hasn't fully played out yet. Often, meaningful change begins exactly like this, not with clear external signs, but with an internal build-up that's difficult to explain. Before anything shifts in reality, there's usually a period where something starts building inside first. It shows up as a kind of emotional tension, a pressure that doesn't fully translate into words. And you might be in that space right now without fully realizing it. Where things once felt closed, there may now be small openings forming. Where everything once seemed decided, something new might be quietly taking shape. It's possible your place in this person's life didn't disappear in the way you once feared. While you've been sitting with uncertainty and unanswered questions, things may have been changing on their side too. Silently, gradually, out of view. The emotional defenses they built around themselves through fear, pride, confusion, or the need for control may not be as solid as they once were. Over time, even the strongest walls can start to weaken. What you've been sensing could come from the reality that emotions don't stay buried forever. Eventually, whatever is suppressed long enough begins to rise back toward the surface, whether someone is ready for it or not. And this connection between you may feel like it runs deeper than surface-level understanding, something that doesn't simply fade just because of time or distance. To understand why this shift may feel so strong now, it helps to consider what may have been happening for them during the silence between you. On the outside, they may have seemed distant but functional, keeping busy, staying composed, maintaining routines, and appearing like they had moved on cleanly. From a distance, it may have looked like closure, but that outward version may have only been part of the truth. It could have been more like a mask they wore, not just for others, but also for themselves, to justify the space they created and convince themselves it was necessary. Over time, maintaining that emotional distance may have become more draining than they expected. Underneath that surface, there may have been an ongoing internal conflict that no one else could see. Moments of quiet reflection where feelings they couldn't easily explain kept resurfacing. Attempts to rely on logic to suppress what they were feeling may have helped for a while, but not completely. Some of it may have come from pride, some from fear, and some from simply not knowing how to hold emotions that felt too intense or too unfamiliar. This is more common than it seems. People don't always step back because they feel too little. Sometimes they step back because they feel too much, and that intensity becomes overwhelming. Being emotionally impacted on a deep level can trigger hesitation, distance, and self-protection. But when a connection reaches a certain depth, reasoning alone starts to lose its strength over time. Gradually, those internal defenses may begin to loosen, and as they do, There can be a growing awareness that life without you doesn't feel as complete or as vivid as it once seemed from a distance. Something important may feel like it's missing, even if they can't fully define what it is. At the same time, they may start recognizing that the version of themselves they've been presenting, the controlled, guarded, emotionally contained version, was never the full truth of who they are. More like a protective role than an identity. And that role may no longer feel sustainable in the same way. Despite every attempt to create space, something within them may continue pulling their thoughts back toward you. Not just as longing, but as something tied to identity, emotion, and inner reflection. It can start to feel less like missing someone and more like a deeper internal shift they can't ignore. There may also have been periods where they tried to outrun these feelings by staying constantly occupied. Work, distractions, social noise, anything to avoid sitting with what was coming up inside. But even then, thoughts may have kept returning, comparisons may have formed, and moments of clarity may have slipped through despite their efforts. All of this builds quietly over time, and eventually it starts to change the emotional landscape. The distractions don't hit the same way anymore. The avoidance becomes harder to maintain, and the internal pressure they once managed to suppress may now be reaching a point where it can't be ignored in the same way. That may be exactly where things are shifting now, where what once felt distant or contained is starting to stir again beneath the surface. They may have convinced themselves that distance would weaken what was between you, that silence would slowly dull the intensity, that time alone would eventually erase your presence from their emotional world. But what may have actually happened is the opposite. The more space that was created, the clearer their feelings may have become. Instead of fading, you may have started to take up even more room in their thoughts. There may have been quiet moments where your memory surfaced without warning. Late evenings before sleep, when everything else finally went still. Or in the middle of conversations surrounded by people, where everything looked normal on the outside, yet something inside still felt incomplete. Even in the middle of noise and distraction, a subtle sense of absence may have remained, gently pulling their attention back toward you again and again. And that is often where something deeper begins to form, when a person finally starts realizing that what they experienced was not just a passing connection or a temporary emotional spark. It may have touched something in them that is rarely reached. And once that realization begins to settle, it changes the way everything else is interpreted. Because when someone truly understands that a bond mattered on a deeper level, it becomes increasingly difficult to pretend otherwise. The mind may still try to argue, still try to rationalize, still try to build distance through logic. But the emotional side doesn't always follow the same rules. And slowly, it begins to speak louder than reasoning can easily silence. There may have been moments where they found themselves remembering things they assumed were insignificant at the time. Small exchanges, ordinary conversations, the way you showed up during moments when things felt difficult for them. The ease of being around you without needing to perform or pretend. That kind of emotional comfort is rare, and once it is no longer present, its absence tends to become much more noticeable than its presence ever was. It leaves behind a space that distractions cannot fully cover. Achievements, routines, other people, and constant activity may fill the surface, but they don't always reach the deeper layer where emotional memory lives. And that is where your presence may have continued to remain. As these realizations grow stronger, the emotional distance they tried to maintain may begin to feel less stable. The explanations that once helped them justify stepping away may slowly lose their weight. Old fears may still exist, but they may no longer feel stronger than the pull to understand what this connection actually meant. This shift rarely happens in a single moment. It tends to unfold quietly, through reflection, discomfort, honesty, and unexpected clarity. Little by little, what was once pushed away begins to return. The feelings they tried to contain may now be resurfacing with more persistence. The questions they avoided may now feel harder to ignore, and what they once placed behind them may feel like it is standing in front of them again, asking to be understood rather than dismissed. And this may also explain why your own inner world has felt more active lately, why certain thoughts arrive without warning, why certain emotions feel sharper than before. Because even without certainty about outcomes, something within you can sense that a shift is happening. There are changes that begin long before they become visible. The emotional world often moves first, while the physical world takes longer to catch up. What appears later on the surface is often just the result of shifts that have already been unfolding quietly for a long time. This person may now be approaching a point where avoiding their emotions feels heavier than facing them, where continuing to run from what they feel requires more effort than honesty itself. And in that process, they may be realizing that some connections are not easily replaced, because they reveal something deeper about who we are when all defenses fall away. As that awareness grows, the way forward may begin to feel different than before. What once felt closed may no longer feel permanent. What once felt silent may no longer feel final. And what was hidden may be moving closer to being acknowledged. What matters most in all of this is understanding that meaningful connections do not simply disappear without leaving a trace. They continue to echo in thought, reflection, and emotional growth long after the moment has passed. They shape understanding in ways that are not always immediately obvious. And if this person is truly moving through the kind of internal process described here, then they may be reaching a place where clarity begins to outweigh confusion, where honesty starts to feel safer than avoidance, where what was once suppressed can no longer stay buried in the same way. For a long time, they may have tried to fill that emptiness elsewhere, only to realize it never fully worked. The more they tried to move forward as if nothing remained, the more clearly they may have begun to understand what was actually left unresolved between you. At first, pride may have convinced them that stepping away meant strength, that they could simply override what they felt. But pride has limits. Eventually, it reaches the point where it can no longer compete with emotional truth. And if that point has arrived, then their perspective on this connection may already be changing. Not as something disposable or temporary, but as something that altered them in a way that cannot simply be undone or ignored. At the same time, something important has also been shifting within you. Even if they still cross your mind and questions still arise, you are no longer in the same emotional place you once were. You have become more aware, more grounded, and more clear through everything you've experienced. You've seen what it feels like to reach towards someone who isn't meeting you halfway. You felt the weight of holding more of the emotional space on your own than you should have had to carry. Gradually, through uncertainty and long stretches of silence, you began pulling your energy back toward yourself. And even though it may not have felt dramatic in the moment, that shift changed everything. There was a time when so much of your emotional world was directed outward toward this person. Your mood, your thoughts, even your sense of stability often depended on whether they responded, whether they showed up, or whether they acknowledged you at all. Your inner balance was quietly tied to their behavior. But over time, something within you grew tired, not in an emotional breakdown or sudden reaction, but in a quieter, deeper way. A part of you started recognizing that your own peace actually mattered. And without forcing anything, you slowly began redirecting your attention inward. Not because you stopped caring, but because you finally started caring for yourself with the same consistency you once offered them. And that is where the shift truly began. When someone constantly gives their attention outward, their presence becomes something others can easily assume will always be there. It blends into the background. It becomes expected rather than appreciated. But when that same energy begins to return inward, when it settles, softens, and no longer reaches outward in the same way, it creates a different kind of awareness in the other person. They start to feel the absence of something they once took for granted. And that is exactly what may be happening now. Not because you are trying to be distant, but because you are no longer overextending yourself just to maintain connection. You are no longer chasing reassurance or stretching your emotional limits to be seen. Instead of weakening the bond, this shift has forced them to face what your presence actually meant to them. And that awareness can create restlessness, a quiet internal discomfort they can't easily explain. Somewhere within them, they are beginning to notice that you are not the same version of yourself they once knew. The one who waited endlessly, the one who tried harder than necessary, the one who bent themselves to keep things alive. That version is no longer fully there, and that realization brings urgency with it. Because when someone starts sensing emotional availability fading, time suddenly feels different, no longer endless, no longer something they can postpone addressing. What often follows is reflection, sometimes uncomfortable reflection. Every delayed response, every avoided feeling, every decision shaped more by fear than honesty begins to weigh more heavily than before. And for the first time, they may not be able to easily dismiss it. Because distance doesn't just weaken bonds, sometimes it reveals them more clearly. It exposes emotional patterns that were previously hidden beneath comfort and routine. It shows where fear was influencing decisions. It also shows where someone may have been taking another person's presence for granted, while assuming it would always remain unchanged. And in that same space, something becomes clear for both sides. You begin to reconnect with yourself, your value, and your emotional independence. And they begin to experience what life feels like without your consistent presence in it. That contrast is what creates clarity. They are not just missing attention. What they are starting to recognize is something deeper: your energy, your emotional depth, the ease of being understood without having to carefully explain every part of themselves, the comfort that came from being around someone who made them feel seen without effort. And once that realization begins to form, it doesn't stay quiet for long. It shows up unexpectedly, in ordinary moments, in familiar places, in random triggers that suddenly bring you back into focus. A sound, a word, a time of day, a passing thought, small things that carry more emotional weight than they should. At first, they may resist it, try to stay in control of it, try to decide when and how they think of you. But emotional truth doesn't follow strict boundaries. It doesn't wait for permission. It surfaces on its own schedule. And eventually, resisting it starts to take more effort than simply acknowledging it. That is often the point where internal resistance begins to weaken. The walls that once felt necessary for protection stop feeling as solid. Instead, they start to feel isolating. What once felt like control begins to feel like distance from something meaningful. Silence changes its meaning too. What once felt like space or relief starts to feel unresolved, heavy, noticeable. And from that space, reflection naturally begins. They start revisiting moments that once seemed small, but now feel different. Times when you tried to understand them while they stayed guarded. Moments when your patience was present, even if not fully recognized. Things that once passed without appreciation now carry weight in memory. Because clarity often arrives late, not early. And with that clarity comes a simple but powerful realization. What you offered was not ordinary. The consistency, the emotional openness, the sense of safety, the ability to be fully themselves without performance or pressure, those things are not as common as they once assumed. Real connection often feels normal while it exists. It doesn't always announce its value in real time. It reveals it slowly, often in hindsight, when absence makes its presence undeniable. They have searched for traces of that feeling in other places, but each attempt has left them with the same emptiness. And over time, those disappointments haven't reduced your significance in their mind. They've sharpened it. There have been nights where they genuinely tried to let go, to end the inner pull completely, only to find their thoughts drifting back to you before the day had even fully ended. Moments where they attempted to cut the emotional thread, only to feel it tighten again in ways they didn't expect. Instead of creating distance, those efforts seem to have revealed just how deeply the connection had already taken hold. Because what was between you was never something surface level. Something in them recognized something real in you, and recognition like that doesn't simply disappear because someone decides it should. And now, something has shifted at a deeper level. Even if they don't openly express it, they feel the difference. They can sense that you are no longer reaching in the same way you once were. You are not emotionally chasing, not waiting at the same intensity, not depending on their responses to regulate your own sense of peace. There is a groundedness in you now that wasn't there before. And strangely enough, that is what has made them more aware of you. When someone stops overextending emotionally and starts returning to themselves, something about their presence changes. It becomes quieter, steadier, more self-contained. And that kind of energy is harder to ignore than neediness ever was. It doesn't demand attention, but it naturally holds it. In that stillness you've developed, they've been left more alone with their own emotional reality. Without your former urgency filling the space, there is less distraction from what they actually feel. And what they feel has not faded. It has become clearer. They are now facing emotions they once assumed would dissolve with time or distance. Instead, those feelings have settled more deeply into awareness. They are no longer something they can casually set aside or rationalize away. Because some connections don't operate on proximity or constant communication, they leave an imprint that continues to shape a person long after silence takes over. And that realization is quietly reshaping the way they see everything, your presence, their choices, and what this connection has actually meant from the beginning. Their thoughts keep circling back. Not occasionally, but repeatedly. And with each return, the resistance weakens a little more. What they feel is becoming harder to deny. Not because it is new, but because it has always been there underneath everything else. You matter to them in a way that goes beyond casual attachment or passing emotion. You've influenced how they understand closeness, vulnerability, and emotional connection itself. And for someone who has spent a long time trying to stay in control, that kind of realization can feel deeply destabilizing. Because accepting it means also accepting vulnerability. It means acknowledging the possibility of being seen, affected, and even hurt. And for a long time, fear has been the structure holding many of their decisions together. Fear of rejection, fear of losing control, fear of emotional exposure. At first, fear felt safer than honesty. It created distance, and distance felt like protection. But fear has limits. It can only suppress truth for so long before it starts becoming heavier than the truth itself. On your side, there has been a return to yourself, a rebuilding of emotional balance, self-respect, and inner steadiness that no longer depends on someone else's responses to feel whole. That shift alone changes everything, even if it happened gradually and without dramatic realization. And on their side, avoidance is no longer offering the same comfort it once did. The distance they created is no longer just distance, it has become reflection. The silence they once relied on has become something they have to sit with. And in that space, feelings they tried to outgrow have only grown clearer. This is often how real emotional understanding unfolds, not through sudden moments, but through quiet accumulation. Through time revealing what distraction once covered. Through absence making presence impossible to misunderstand. What they are now facing is not new. It is simply unacknowledged for longer than it should have been. And what you have stepped into is not loss, but clarity. The clarity of knowing your value more deeply than before, without needing to chase it in someone else's uncertainty. And so the situation is no longer defined by confusion. It is defined by realization on both sides. One learning to stop abandoning themselves, and the other learning that what was once taken for granted cannot always be assumed to remain the same. In the end, what remains is simple. If something is meant to be understood, it will eventually be seen clearly. And if something truly matters, silence does not erase it. It only brings it into sharper focus until it can no longer be ignored.